สวัสดีค่ะคุณทิมพิธานั่งตรงนี้นะคะนี่เป็นไลฟ์โดย iPhone 16 Pro Max ครั้งแรกนะคุณทิมยังไม่มาเลือกที่นั่งได้ตามสบายแต่ว่าป้านั่งแถวสองว่าจะนั่งตรงนั้นแต่ไม่เอาดีกว่ามันจะชัดไหมชัดยังอย่างนี้ไหนป้าเอ็มมาไม่ทันรถไฟดูดิดูเวลาผิดป้าไปถึงเพนสเตชันตั้งแต่ตีห้ารถไฟออกตี5:45แต่ป้าเอ็มไปจำผิดเป็นตี5:55ก็ถ่ายวิดีโอถ่ายคลิปเพลินพอได้ยินเสียงเขาประกาศรีบลงไปตรงบันไดที่11พอไปแล้วรถไฟออกไปแล้ว2 นาทีป้าแทบร้องไห้แล้วเขาไม่คืนเงินนะคะมันจะมีเที่ยวต่อไปคือ7 โมงกี่นาทีไม่รู้แพงมากต้องจ่ายแพงป้าก็เลยตัดสินใจให้ลูกซื้อตั๋วรถบัสซึ่งมันอยู่ไม่ไกลจากเพนสเตชันค่ะป้าก็มารถบัสเที่ยว6:30มาถึงเซาท์สเตชันประมาณ10 โมงกว่าแต่กว่าเท่าไหร่ป้าไม่รู้เดินหารถซับเวย์สายแดงอะเดินหาจนเจอพอมาถึงฮาร์วาร์ดสแควร์ป้าก็ถามทางหามันก็คือตึกเดิมนะตึกเดิมที่คุณทิมพูดครั้งนั้นแต่ว่าคนละห้องค่ะห้องนี้จะเล็กกว่าเขาถึงบอกมีจำกัดที่นั่งเลยค่ะเพราะมีที่นั่งจำกัดคุณทิม
Just to reserve a place. It's a place saver.
สวัสดีค่ะป้าเอ็มมาไทยไหมคะไปค่ะสวัสดีค่ะอันนี้อยู่ๆเดี๋ยวก่อนอันนี้อยู่ๆโกไลฟ์เลยแปลกป้าไม่กล้าออกไปป้าอยากจะออกไปให้เห็นคุณทิมตอนคุณทิมเดินมาป้าอาจจะปากออกไปนะเดี๋ยวกันนะคะป้าถ่ายป้าไลฟ์พร้อมกัน2 ช่องป้าไลฟ์พร้อมกัน2 ช่องวายมันในการอันนี้ป้าอยากออกไปป้าอยากออกไป
Of course, right? Like, you gotta skip exactly. Yeah. How's yours? Like, what are you focusing on for the semester right now?
ป้าจะออกไปดูคุณทิมเดี๋ยววางไว้ตรงนี้ก่อนนะ
All of us are the same. So, like, this whole thing was a lot of work. Did you work with Professor Hope? Or we are writing
You asked many intelligent questions, and I'm sorry you were mistaken for being Russian. What a fascinating but eccentric man.
Yeah.
What was your? I had to run away right after, so I didn't get a chance to debrief with anybody. But what was your thought?
I can't stay the whole time. I apologize.
That's
for the
okay.
meetings, but
Professor, we were in communication briefly. My name is Ken.
Oh, very nice to meet you, Ken.
But thank you so much for
Yeah.
agreeing to lend your expertise. This
Happy to
whole
do
event
it.
is very exciting. I have Professor Hai is in the room with us, I think. But I think Peter and Fatima are
Still on their way? Okay, I'm gonna run to the washroom quickly and
Of
then.
course. I also wanted to ask, I presume we don't need introductions before you start the panel.
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much.
Did you also actually want to this is here?
Wait, did you go to the one that
no.
we went to different.
Same like the person. I might not again. He's probably more. But I feel like he's very.
They're very opinionated, but also very contentious. Which makes it very interesting.
That is art.
They had done a side by side. That
Oh
would
my
be,
god, that would have been the best show ever. I wonder if they've ever had.
but I think we need to prevent people from being nice. So they'll be like standing on each other. What do you think?
Hello, thank you for making it. You know, and I really like your sweater game. Every time I see you, it's like you're getting more and more. Yeah, I'm very excited. After this is done, you know, Jorge will still hear from me, but I will be done with these kind of organizings until next semester. So I'm very excited. Yeah, but you know, it'll happen when it happens. Please enjoy.
Sorry, thank you for the webinar. So I gave you a code.
Thank you so much. So what I'm hoping is I will like monitor the questions. Do you think I don't think so. I think it's great. So maybe we just ask people, especially for the audience, I think online, louder might be better. As long as like, our mind goes through our picture, like,
So there's another event. Hey, Matt. Hey, how are you? Good. Nice to see you. That's the first problem. Well, I'm doing the. I'm doing the question too. You're doing the questions. Okay, great.
I suppose the way that we did it last time was Professor was like, he's very room and every hour or so come check for conversation.
Yeah.
But feel free
Yeah,
to.
just ask you to use the judgment.
I think so.
Interesting ones?
I think so, because first come, first served doesn't work well.
No.
And
Yeah,
I
especially
also,
in this.
I also,
Everywhere
you know, this is a room where I feel it's small enough, but we might not want one mic. It would be great if maybe so it might be good to post preaching.
So like,
Online audience might have trouble.
Okay. So good. I can also.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, if you get any indication from the online participants that they're having just like.
And maybe I'll just use my judgment. Once I feel that there's like a critical mass of like interesting questions, I'll just raise my hand. And then I think that might work better than you coming in at a regular interval. There might be good, there might be bad stuff.
That's so cool. And I'll probably, it's 90 minutes. So I'll interview 50, 60, and then, yeah, I think it'll pick up.
As, you know, wonderful, wonderful hard stuff. And I'm really excited because a lot of the folks online will be zooming from Southeast Asia, so they're very generously saying that.
No, it sounds good. All right. Well, head up.
Thank you.ใช่ใช่กินแล้วครับ US
ยังไง
โอเคเซตจริงๆแบบเซตเสร็จแล้วก็วิ่งไปกินข้าวเลย
ครับ
โ
Hello, hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, David.
Nice to see you.
I don't remember, but we met when you were from Singapore.
That would be great.
Yeah. I graduated a few years ago. But my undergrad. She's really excited for all.
That makes me nervous. Sino-American.
I may come up there to do the introduction, and I imagine you know all
He's actually upstairs in the green room. Fran just went out.
Okay.
He's in
No. I suggest we don't start. Because we've got the info. I told you to one down before it's not full. And folks will trickle in. This venue is mad. It's not a mad person. He heard high speak. This is not.
Have you collaborated with all of them?
I don't know. My job was to have it turns out Henri said he never met you. He knows a lot about you, but
I see.
he hasn't met you.
I see.
I like that.
So,
คุณทิมมาแล้ว
แต่เรามีคำถามมันคือเรามีคำถามแทนข้อสอบเลยแพ็กเกจว่าเคยเห็นมีมาว่าแบบแพ็กเกจนะครับนี่จะมีแอปเปิลแล้วก็พอไปสอบจริงเขาเคยมาเป็นสามคล้ายๆกันไหมแอดวานซ์ตัวเลเวลข้อสอบมันจะเกี่ยวกับสมัครในแบบใน
All right, I know we're on the north side of the river, but I teach at the business school and we start things exactly on time. So we might as well get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthias Viviger. I teach in the Business, Government, and International Economy unit across the river at HBS, and I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation on the implications of the elections in India, Indonesia, and the United States for Southeast Asia. Joining us are three individuals with a really wide array of both scholarly and practical experience and expertise. I will introduce each of them in turn, and from there we can come to our discussion. So starting at my far left, Hai Nguyen is the co-founder and director of the Global Vietnam War Studies Initiative and the Unseen Legacies of the Vietnam War Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. A historian by training, like me, he has devoted his career to exploring the history and the legacy of the Vietnam Wars, particularly through some really path-breaking oral history work. To his right, Fatima Zumar is the executive director of the storied Center for International Development and a lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School. Before joining CID, she served in the Biden administration working on matters of international development, and prior to that worked for a number of lawmakers on foreign policy issues. And finally, to my immediate left, Peter Limjarunrat, is chief advisor to the leader of Thailand's Move Forward Party. For those of you who don't know Peter's history, he led the Move Forward Party to victory in Thailand's 2023 elections and was poised to become prime minister, but his ascent was thwarted by the country's Senate and its unelected constitutional court. So he's now serving as an advisor, but before he entered politics, Pita also worked at Grab, Agri-Food, and BCG, so experience both in the worlds of politics and business. So before we come to our conversation, let me briefly set the scene for those of you who need any reminder of the events that have transpired over the last 9 months. So in February 2024, Indonesians went to the polls and elected as their president Prabowo Subianto in the first round of balloting. Over 7 weeks then, between April and June of 2024, Indians re-elected Narendra Modi as prime minister for a third term, although his BJP lost its outright majority in the Lok Sabha, and Modi had to cobble together a coalition government for the first time. And finally, 2 days ago, Americans went to the polls in a hotly contested election and elected as their president Donald Trump, who became the first Republican to win the national popular vote in 2 decades. Now, our goal today is to think through the implications of these elections for Southeast Asia. I know some of this material is front of mind for many of you, particularly in the room. Emotions are raw, but rather than thinking about their implications for us in the room, we want to keep focused on the implications of these elections for ASEAN and for Southeast Asia. We'll spend a bit of time delving into specific issue areas like economics, politics, security, and climate. But I think I'd like to begin just by posing a general question to each of our panelists, and that is whether, in your view, these elections taken together mark continuity or change for Southeast Asia. Are these continuity elections taken together or change elections? What do you think? Sure, why don't we start with you?
Well, this year marked a remarkable journey for democracy as 4 billion people go to the polls, and just these 3 countries, that's 1.3 eligible voters that went to the poll and decide. And we see some continuity with criticism, and that's the ASEAN circle I'm talking about. A larger circle, which is the Asian one, that's continuity with compromise, because BJP won, but only 240, so they need to form an alliance with NDA to become 293 in order to form the government. So continuity, but definitely with some compromise with the state. And in America is 360 change. So then you see these things that are coming from them, and I would think about the implication for ASEAN countries and ASEAN government in 3 different circles, from within ASEAN itself, and then within Asia, and the rest of the world, which is going through my head. And I know the breakdown of statistics in terms of relationship, in terms of security, in terms of climate. So to finish my round, it's 20-40-40. So the intra-ASEAN, which is impacted by the Indonesian election, that's 20% of the total trade for Thailand. 40%, that's Asia minus ASEAN, so China and India, that's what we're talking about. And then the rest of the world is 40% of the trade between Thailand and the rest of the world. So if I structure it like this, I have 20-40-40, and I know where to prioritize in terms of geographics, and also in terms of geopolitical tension that might come from it. The Thai trade with the Chinese is 17%, with the American is 11%. that's about more than a quarter of the trade between Thailand and the Sino-American rivalry that might accelerate in the future. So I'll take it from them.
For me, I think that if we want to see the continuity or a change, we can look from the personal, regional, and global perspective. From Vietnam, the very stable relationship between the Indian and the Southeast Asia country and Vietnam, I think is very stable, especially the case of Vietnam and Indian or Vietnam Indonesia. Since the 1950 until now, I think the relationship between Vietnam and India and Indonesia are very, especially about the U.S. and Vietnam, is very complicated. And with the Donald Trump's second term, I think that about the personality, very difficult to understand. He unbreakable, the personality and policy, and so how he, the policy hostile or not, to China, and how the government deal with the war in Ukraine and Russia, and how he, deal with the allies in Asia and Southeast Asia, including Japan, South Korea, and Philippines. And from Vietnam, I think the Hanoi look very closely the Trump policy to deal with the ally, with the allies in South Asia and East Asia and Western country. So I think the Vietnam and South Asia country maybe adjust their policy how to fit well with the U.S., the new government from the U.S.
So I'll just say, well, first I'll say thanks for having this conversation, right? Such a time after the election, I really want to thank the Asia Center, the Ash Center, and the Rajwali Foundation Institute for Asia. So thank you for pulling all this together. Before I answer your question, I just want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I'm going to answer the question. So I'm going to actually take off my Harvard hat for this conversation. I'm going to actually put on my Washington hat. So I served in the Biden administration. I was the vice president for compact operations at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where we worked extensively in different parts of Southeast Asia. And then before that, in the Obama administration, I was the deputy assistant secretary of state for South and Central Asia, where I covered a lot of our regional and economic policies. I also served in the Trump administration. So I'm going to kind of just draw a little bit on where we're coming from, because for whatever revolutions could be ahead, actually there's also things that any administration has to build on as well. So maybe just a scene set before I get to your question. I just want to make sure we understand the economic significance of what we're talking about in terms of GDP for ASEAN is actually really profound. It's about, in 2022, the whole block of these 10 countries was $10.2 trillion, which is about 6.5% global GDP. So this is quite a significant region to be having this conversation. And when we think about, I'll start with the U.S. because that's the context I know the best on U.S. foreign policy. When we think about the United States and what this means for ASEAN, ASEAN is the U.S.'s fourth largest trading partner. And it is ASEAN's #1 source of FDI, on foreign direct investment. So these agreements that we are building on and have in place, including the TIFAs, the Trade and Investment Framework Agreements, and the other agreements that have been put in place are going to be really important indicators of how much this holds going into a Trump administration. Whether you're in the Democratic side of foreign policy in Washington or the Republican side, I would say that ASEAN has been an important bloc for the United States. I don't expect that to change in the Trump administration. You can't underestimate the value of these economies for the U.S. markets. What I do think, though, is going to change as you think about it from a U.S. perspective is that it's unclear to me right now from the campaign, the Trump campaign and going forward, how much they're going to negotiate multilaterally versus bilaterally with different countries in the region. Multilateralism has tended to be an area where they pulled back during the first Trump administration in every major arena, including in ASEAN. And so you could see, I don't know that U.S. interest in Southeast Asia and the ASEAN bloc is going to decline for lots of different reasons. We'll talk about China, and I think China's going to come up in this conversation, and how the U.S. positions itself vis-a-vis China, but multilateralism in the traditional context, and particularly what you saw in the Biden administration, I do see a setback in terms of where that would be going and how those agreements are arranged. And the last thing I would just say is, I think we could expect to see some pragmatism on the security side of some of these arrangements, particularly around the South China Seas and what that looks like. But again, I suspect a lot of this is going to be in reaction to the U.S.-China relationship and how that plays out in the ASEAN market for bilateral economic tariffs and FDIs. I'm going to pause there on the U.S. side. I'm happy to come back more in India and Indonesia, which I think are more continuity.
Okay, sounds good. So the Peter and Fatima, both of you centered economics in your responses. So why don't we delve into economic issues in particular? It seems to me that Modi, Prabhu, and Trump all seem, one element of continuity is that they all seem devoted to furthering this protectionist impulse in economic management, albeit through different sectors and institutions and mechanisms. And I wonder how you think this emphasis on protectionism, on reshoring or friendshoring is likely to affect the economies of the ASEAN world. Does this pose an opportunity? Does this pose a threat? In what sense? How does this all net out?
I think both depends on the sector, but it could be both opportunities and threats. If Trump administration is talking about 10% tariff and 60% tariff on the Chinese, Thailand, in terms of trade surplus, is number 12 on that list. So it could be possible that there's some threat in terms of tariff to the Thai producers in some sectors. Trump has been criticizing about CHIP Act, so the semiconductor and electronic industry in Thailand, in Taiwan, in South Korea is also up for debate going forward. But there's also opportunities in the short term only, I think, that if 60% tariff to the Chinese goods incoming to America becomes a reality, and that means the ASEAN producers in the short term could fill in that gap in terms of cost competitiveness with the Chinese goods coming in. But then I take a step back and look at the American economy when it comes to relying to international trade. It's 27%. So if Trump won because of cost of living crisis and inflation, but you're importing a lot of raw materials and maybe primary sources of products to be manufactured here in America, and then you export it out. That's like 27% of your economy. So I'm wondering what the setback of setting a tariff against your own imports and exports, as well as a possible trade retaliation from the Chinese, and why would that be good for the economy as a whole in the long term for anybody? So again, it's like opportunities and threats, and then short term and long term, direct and indirect. Like strong dollars is very immediate, very direct, for example. But if what happens in terms of trade retaliation of such major powers, and what does that mean for middle power economy like Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia, Australia, for example?
We were talking about this in my class this morning, and I'm really pleased to see a number of the policy design delivery students here, but we were talking about this morning about, especially if you're an international student here at Harvard, one of your reactions to the election might be that you're surprised how little attention there is on international issues as voters went to the polls here in the United States. And what I think, what I suspect is going to happen here is you're going to see a doubling down of an America First agenda come back to Washington, where you're going to see a much more nationalist, closed borders, closed mentality in terms of really pushing an America First agenda. I think there will be economic ramifications for that, depending on where you're on the value chain. At this point, of what that looks like and where you're positioned both on the value chain, but where you're positioned geographically. So, for instance, in ASEAN, I don't know how real these threats of the tariffs are. I mean, there's one thing to say something on a campaign trail. I love throwing out numbers too. It doesn't mean they happen, and there's a lot to get through, including, and of course, if the Republicans sweep the House and have full control But so there has been talk on the trail, for those of you following the campaign trail, of up to 60% tariffs on any goods coming from China to US markets. And for other countries, tariffs as high as 20%, including in the ASEAN market. What's unclear to me are some of the ramifications for Chinese goods manufactured in ASEAN countries outside of China. So could Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, for instance, get hit doubly, both with the 20% tariff on the bilateral relationship, but could they get doubly charged for, because there's Chinese manufacturing in those countries that then enter the US market? I don't know. I don't know how that's going to play out and what that would look like. Again, in any political campaign, it's hard to know what's going to translate in the 100-day plan, so we'll have to get more clues from the 100-day plan of what that actually looks like. But the second thing, I do think there could be opportunities. So this all sounds pretty grim. Maybe it's grim. There could be opportunities, though, in what the different manufacturing industries are that ASEAN markets will capitalize on. To your point, I mean, there are going to be goods that the U.S. economy needs to be competitive in this space. My guess is the number one issue for voters. I mean, we talked about this in my class this morning. I mean, I used the example of the price of eggs at the grocery store. I mean, it really came down to a lot of pocketbook issues. Americans are feeling the high cost of inflation. The fact that most Americans can't buy and get the down payment on the mortgage of the first house anymore, and I mean, Boston alone is that $500,000 now for your first house. But many markets are facing this crunch. The fact that education costs are so skyrocketing that most Americans can't, live beyond paycheck to paycheck right now. I think that's the vein that the campaign tapped into successfully for where the numbers broke out across the country. So as you think about what a job creation strategy is, as you think about the fourth industrial revolution and what that means for the AI industry and jobs and automation of jobs vis-a-vis what people can actually afford to do, there could be opportunities in those spaces if they add to American job creation and what that actually looks like. I think we'll talk about climate separately, so I'm going to hold on the climate side, but I suspect there'll be some major transitions and challenges there. Paris, but I was also thinking about the EV markets as we think about what that means, particularly for non-Chinese economies and companies in ASEAN, the EV market, and what that would mean, because you could glut the market.
So I think that in his first term, Trump pulled out of the Pacific Partnership, and with our down, I guess, he pulled out in the Pacific Economic Framework. So how the ASEAN country to reorganize or find out new opportunity to work with the small or the medium power, like Japan, South Korea, and to balance the benefits of the economy, especially maybe to open the little window to work with China, especially to make it between Vietnam and China, and very good, and how to get economic investment from the China, and some of the company from Taiwan, from the China who wanted to be out of China and move to Vietnam. And recently I got the news from Taiwan, SpaceX, from the Elon Musk, moved on partner with satellite manufacturing from Taiwan to the Hannan province. So, broadly speaking, I saw the political or the economic analysts, they always talk about maybe the outcome of the US election and likely to have a effect on the Asia, especially Vietnam. But I think, maybe not 100%, it will change a little bit. And we hope, so both sides, to see how they get the benefit to each other. And I get, because Donald Trump is visiting, maybe he always, focus on the transactional, how to get more economic investment from the Southeast Asia and another country.
So Fatima has pointed to this dynamic. Where is this tension between pocketbook issues in the United States and the Trump administration's ideological project of protectionism? How is that tension perhaps going to play out? And Hai pointed towards the possibility of greater market integration between ASEAN and China. I want to bring to front of mind something that did happen during the Trump administration. as many American firms in the midst of the U.S.-China trade war that ramped up steam in 2018 pursued a China plus one strategy of duplicating or building resiliency and redundancy into their supply chains. The Trump administration branded Vietnam a currency manipulator, and that's a designation that the Biden administration subsequently removed. Do you think that offers any hints about how the incoming Trump administration might behave towards ASEAN states?
You can see the Trump, how to solve the policy to Russia. And during his first term, he threatened Vietnam and he used Section 301, carry out investigation into Vietnam, how currency and trade deficits and trade surplus. But that his language, in reality, looked like he favored Vietnam. And so far, the Vietnamese people and the Hanoi government hope they can use, the weak Trump administration, and they hope, that Trump will have, something exchange, exchange. For example, the Trump government encouraged Vietnam to focus on energy imports, right? And so, if the Vietnam provides something, and I hope, maybe the Trump administration can adjust, his policy to Vietnam, and because Vietnam know about the political position between China and Vietnam, so maybe and of course, the Vietnam, I guess, Vietnam don't want to be juggling the ball between China and U.S., but Vietnam know how to deal with the Trump administration. Last September, when the new chairman and General Secretary told them to visit New York, have a new MOU between the Trump organization and the Hưng Yên province to invest new project, real estate project at Hưng Yên province, around $1,500,000,000. So we can see, and I think that, like I said, very predictable predictable, the policy from Trump. But I guess, the basic on the very good relationship, especially personal relationship between the Trump and the Hanoi leader. So maybe they can have a little negotiation.
So, okay, maybe then we can zoom out and think about this in historical context. So that the post-Cold War era of hyper-globalization was one of the only eras in modern human history in which we saw genuine economic convergence. That is, developing countries growing on average more quickly than developed economies. Again, Modi, Prabowo, Trump, all of them seem devoted to rolling back this era of globalization. And yet all of them have set extraordinarily ambitious growth targets. Modi's target of India becoming a high-income economy by 2049 will require, I think, 10 to 12% per annum GDP growth. Prabowo wants to grow Indonesia at 8% per annum. How, in your view, can Southeast Asian states navigate a world of slowing or waning globalization while endeavoring to meet some of their ambitious growth targets?
Time. I think with time they'll understand that decoupling or deglobalization would not be able to give them enough inputs for them to achieve their goals that they promised to the people. I feel like with the linkages, like again, if you are an ASEAN leaders or any governments thinking about what's going on in the world, and you divide it into circles or blocks. The first one, 20%, is intra-ASEAN. The bigger circle, that's intra-Asia. And then the other one is the entire world. You have 20, 40, 40. You have to, have strategies for each circle. The first one, you have to boost regional cohesion in order for you to have enough inputs to achieve that growth. For the intra-Asia is about expanding market reach beyond China and India. And then the rest of the world is about diversification. It's simple as that. That's if you divide the problems into a manageable size of each of the circle in terms of how important each trade block is to you. And then that's how you respond to it in order for you to achieve the kind of growth that you promised to the voters. But both very ambitious, and I think a lot of trade issues is related to the security issue and also to the climate problems as well, because nowadays we talk about economy, tourism, trade, but then all these severe chronic environmental problems that kept happening in parts of Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. It's not going to be able to add up to the numbers that you promised the voters, in my opinion.
I mean, I would just say first, I think just as an outside observer of ASEAN, not someone who's in it, I think it's incredible what ASEAN has achieved, actually, and keeps deepening every decade of this regional cooperation. In fact, there's very few places in the world where this regional cooperation works. And so I spent a decade of my career in the South Central Asia space trying to do this in South Asia, in Central Asia. And we're starting at close to zero, right? You have SARC, you have a couple of these very nascent institutions, but you can't get beyond geographic and cultural distrust that's historically embedded into the system. So you have very little regional trade, regional cooperation, regional energy. And so you trade more with others farther away from you than you just do in your own home backyard, right? And so that's true actually in most of Africa. That's true in most of other parts of Asia. Asia's so big, we always talk about Asia as if it's this one block, most of South and Central Asia is completely disjointed and non-connected to each other. You have to go out to Europe, to the Russians, to the Chinese, to the US, European markets. So I would just say first and foremost, as an outside observer to this, ASEAN and those countries in ASEAN should double down on regional cooperation and not take it for granted. I think it's incredible what it's achieved. There's going to be challenges to navigate from geopolitical actors here that are going to be significant, and we're going to have to think about them and how to do it. I think it's ironic in many ways that you at least have with Modi and Trump, two leaders who have campaigned on growing their own economies while shutting out others. And that's a theory of change. That's a theory of change that researchers and academics and others will look at and observe. Can you do that? Can you accomplish 10, 12% growth? Can you become a high-income country to do that? I have my doubts. I think you may have your doubts about that, but that's their theory of change. I want to just talk about India and Indonesia maybe for a moment, since we talked about the US. So if you look, you're right, Modi, of course, the BJP is a much more weakened coalition than it was after this historic 6-week election earlier this year. That being said, I don't suspect that we're going to see a huge shift in their foreign policy when it comes to ASEAN. This is a region where already trade between India and ASEAN is over $130 billion US. I think Modi wants to grow that and deepen those ties in the ASEAN markets. There's a lot for India to gain from these regional trade ties, but also people-to-people ties are increasingly important in Southeast Asia. If you look at where the Indian diaspora is at and how much it's growing and how much it's leading businesses in those areas, I think we should never underestimate. The one thing you cannot take back in 2024 is that our people are all around the world. We're no longer just in our own countries of origin. And that's not going to automatically change overnight, where everyone all of a sudden has to go back to where they're originally from. And I think you see that in the American experiment. I think you see that with the Indian diaspora. Increasingly the Indonesian diaspora as well, if you look at markets in Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, and other places as well. Indonesia, on the other hand, may take a very different approach. It could take a very different approach than India, where the president has kind of stressed and said that its major focus is not necessarily different in terms of trade development or economics, but it's really going to focus on food self-sufficiency, nutrition programs, and how to really double down on growth within Indonesia. So how that affects choices bilaterally and regionally in the ASEAN bloc, I think will play out. But I don't know about the theory. I'm curious how the theory of change actually holds. Can you get 12% growth and not trade with the world?
Yeah,
Okay, so we'll see. Why don't we then turn to security issues, because those I think are front of mind for many people. And if I can, I'd like to pull the focus a little bit away at the beginning of this discussion, away from Trump, and maybe think first about Prabowo. So for those of you who don't know, Prabowo Subianto has a long and storied and checkered controversial career, but he is widely regarded as more of an internationalist than his predecessor, Joko Widodo, and seems determined to have Indonesia step up and act as a genuine middle power in international affairs. So I'm wondering how you see Prabowo navigating the challenges of the global conjuncture, from US-China competition to Israel's war in Gaza to the war in Ukraine. Just what do you think Indonesia will do with its newfound conscientiousness of its status as a middle power?
Yeah, I think you might be right, because he's set to meet Xi Jinping in a couple of days. And mid-November, he was scheduled to come and meet the president-elect or the president of America. So I think he has that international ambition, which might be a bit higher than Jokowi, because to the ASEAN leaders, when it was like the Russian and Ukraine conflict happening, Jokowi was the only leader of ASEAN who visited both Putin and Zelensky, because he understood that rule-based world order. He understood that foreign policy is important to the palm oil prices of the farmers in Indonesia, because of the soybean prices, because of the corn prices. So Jokowi was very active in terms of foreign policy when it comes to the ASEAN leaders already, and the hypothesis that Prabowo being even more international. So I think that emphasizes the middle power status that Indonesia is trying to do. Remember, in 2020, that's when Jokowi refused or rejected the 9-dash line, the South China Sea conflict, and not many countries were audacious enough to do that. I think the Vietnamese government was referring to a rule-based clause on maritime navigation with the international world order of how it's to be done, but I think it was Jokowi who rejected outright in 2020. So I think with Indonesia being the largest country in ASEAN and playing international ambition, would be good for ASEAN as a whole. However, the credibility, because you started off your question with the history, with the past of Prabowo's legacy in terms of how much legitimacy he has when it comes to rule-based world order, or when it comes to peace. We'll have to wait and see.
Most about Indonesia, but from the historical perspective, I saw the relationship between Vietnam and Indonesia, improved and stepped up very good. And during the last September, the president-elect Subianto, right, from Indonesia visited Vietnam, and they agreed to appraise, the relationship between Indonesia and Vietnam, the comprehensive strategic partnership. The first country from Asia become the comprehensive strategic partnership with Vietnam, and I think that maybe from the Indonesia, they want to fortify, they have to bolster regional, the strength. And if we have a united or solidarity, the Asian country association, I think the ASEAN country can unite with China and another greater power.
I think we could expect him. I think we could see a more assertive foreign policy coming out of Jakarta in general, given a lot of the relationships he has, a lot of the relationships he wants to cultivate. I think we do suspect that Indonesia will continue to play a very active role in ASEAN in particular. Indonesia, like India actually in similar ways, has really ambitious growth strategies as well, and also has massive infrastructure needs in order to achieve that growth. So I wonder, even if there's a more assertive foreign policy coming out of Where does it run at odds in terms of non-American, for a moment, putting the Trump calculation in on climate, environmental climate goals as well? If we're talking about infrastructure, more land clearing, more forest degradation in order to build at the expense of broader global ambitions that the world has in some of those spaces. I'm curious where some of those climate foreign policies come in conflict as well, in addition to just a very pragmatic approach to Indonesia's role on the world stage. I mean, Indonesia deserves to be punching above its weight given its population size, the strength of its economy. I suspect in general there's going to be an upward trend of that over the next 50 years anyway, just given what the demographics at play. But how you build quickly in a carbon-intensive world right now is going to be a real challenge for the Indonesians to navigate and meet. Again, they may get a reprieve during the Trump years to be able to do that quickly in terms of whatever deals that are struck. If there's a big regression, which I suspect a lot of us expect to see around Paris agreements and on the climate side coming out of the United States and the Trump administration.
So one thing I've been wondering about myself is so earlier this year, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, underwent a major expansion. Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, and the UAE joined the organization. Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand became BRICS partner countries. I'm wondering if you see a genuine role does this augur a larger role for the BRICS within global diplomacy, within global security arenas? And if so, what do you see the role of Southeast Asian perspectives in that role as being?
Within Thailand, we've been discussing and asking about, because to give you a context, Thailand is applying for both OECD and BRICS at the same time. So in a short sentence, it's probably diversifying alignment, at face value of being neutral. But then the real question is what the country or the government or the people are getting in terms of the sacrifice that it needs to make in order to be part of both OECD and BRICS. For example, if Thailand is joining OECD, it's not just the face value, but also the way they manage public finances, the way they manage national budget, and that will be an improving efficiency in the way the government is organized. That's the real question. Now, that kind of question is being applied to BRICS as well as a partner, and the question remains. I mean, the government is being asked this kind of questions, and they haven't provided a proper result. If there is, I see that's a good move then. If there isn't, it's just a superficial diversification in terms of alignment with two sides of the world. It's really the content that matters more than the format.
From Vietnam has a long history and allied with Russia, China, and India, three the key power for the BRICS organization, right? So Vietnam, I think, are ready to work with this organization through what the Vietnam said, multi-directional relationship. And so I think that's a good opportunity for Vietnam or an Asian country to develop a relationship and to reap the benefits from the economy or including security. For example, in the Vietnam, how Vietnam have to deal with Russia, work with Russia and India and China to balance and protect territorial integrity of Vietnam. So political and economic from the Vietnam situation will always combine. And I guess maybe another country in Southeast Asia, when we talk about economy, we have to count on the security faster. Because the Southeast Asia country, anyway, small country, when they with greater power.
I don't have an answer. I just have a reflection, which is, it's so interesting in 20 years how much the shape of multilateral alliances have changed and continue to evolve. And I think it's the assumptions that we had 20 years ago, picking sides and then sticking to those sides forever, whichever way you fell post-Cold War. You're seeing a lot more hedging happening because largely a lot of US uncertainty of whether or not any of these transitions and promises can outlast 4 or 8 years. And what does that mean if you're a smaller country trapped between all these big power politics, is my guess. It's unclear to me sometimes what the multilateral alliances actually get smaller countries beyond the huge cost of membership to get in. There's a lot of effort. When I was a former US diplomat, I can't tell you how many times, how many meetings a year, paper, conferences we go to lay a foundation for membership into something, and then years later the membership happens, and then you're like, what's supposed to happen now, right? And sometimes it's unclear what the real benefits are, and so I would ask, countries, like, make sure you really know what you're getting for all the effort going into something, and that it's tangible and it actually adds value to that setup. But it's interesting about how much hedging is also happening. At the same time, I suspect you're going to see a huge pullback of multilateralism from the US in the coming 4 years. And that, what does that mean for broader multilateral alliances at a global stage, whether that's the United Nations, the World Bank, the fact that you have, I can't remember the exact statistic right now, but if you look at the debt crisis that's happening, mostly in Africa, but in other economies as well. I mean, with this massive pullback that you're going to have from ODA accounts, from the world stage, especially UN markets, who's going to be filling in some of those gaps as well, if anyone?
Another lingering question is what happens to Quad now?
Yeah.
So that's another thing. So Modi is re-elected. Modi has maintained India's multi-aligned foreign policy posture. He is preserving, deepening his relationship with Russia. He famously hugged Putin at the most recent BRICS summit that upset a bunch of Western diplomats. You have some ASEAN states joining the BRICS. You have AUKUS happening nearby. You have the Quad. One of the things that ASEAN has really tried to do over the last few decades is maintain what's called ASEAN centrality in the management of any disputes or issues in the region. And all of these other organizations cropping up, people seem to be suggesting that maybe ASEAN is going to have a harder time maintaining its centrality. Do you think that's a legitimate worry? Are you worried about that as well? And if so, what can ASEAN do to try to re-seize that centrality?
Both centrality and relevancy. It's a two-part question. It's not just the centrality of trying to come up with a consensus, come up with a common ground. We talk about Indonesia and India, I'm thinking about Myanmar right away, because 5-point consensus was developed when Indonesia was the head of ASEAN. But then many years have passed, and with no centrality and with no relevancy, that 5-point consensus becomes 5 bullet points rather than a 5-year roadmap. So I think with the new incoming leaders in ASEAN, whether it's Lawrence Wong, Hun Manet, Babong, Tongtan in Thailand, they're all new leaders, they're all younger, they all have some family names, that dynasty politics and things like that. Gibran in Indonesia. If they can get together and really think about what ASEAN has achieved in history and can imagine together what the future of ASEAN might look like given what's going on in the past few days, would be something that allows centrality and then become relevant once again in the global world order. Now, the first part of your question started off with India. India and Thailand is quite special and underappreciated and underutilized because there's ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, that's one, and there's BIMSTEC, which is another one.
I worked on that.
Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to you.
I actually know what it means.
So ASEAN has a charter, and now BIMSTEC is going to have a charter as well. They're going to have a secretariat, they're going to have ways of resolving conflicts and things like that. So that's something as I think of as an opportunity for Thailand to separate ways. And then if they can divide and conquer and really strategize on what to achieve out of these two, both in terms of trade and security, because they do a joint Navy exercise together, they do a joint Air Force exercise together, they do a joint Army exercise together, and I think that means another security edge as well. So to me, that's something that is something that is underutilized and has to be think about.
I think Vietnam learned a lot to not speak expensive lesson from the war. And during the war, the Vietnam side with the US from South Vietnam, and the North Vietnam side, China or Russia, you know the tragic story during the post-war. So I think the Vietnam can learn how to use or balance and exploit, the conflict between the great power. For example, during the war, Hanoi government wanted to balance and deal with the Soviet Union and China to gain, the military equipment and economic aid from the both sides, right? And today's, I think that Vietnam, focus on maybe centralized, however, maybe decentralized relationship. For example, when the Vietnam pursued, the non-allied policy, known as the Four No's, with its no military allies, no siding with one country against another, no foreign military base, and no using the Vietnamese territory to oppose other countries, and no using force or threatening to use force in international relations. However, another side, Vietnam also developed multilateral foreign policy focused on strategy and comprehensive partnership, trade agreement, and multilateralism. So I think that how we can, carry out what Vietnam said, bamboo diplomatic policy, very flexible, and to deal with global crisis.
So let's think then, bring the United States back in. And I want to dig a little bit more deeply into this question of what we can expect from the Trump administration in Southeast Asia. We've heard that there might be a decline in multilateralism, but I think the front of mind for American policymakers, front of mind for many Southeast Asian policymakers as well, is the question of Sino-American rivalry. And I'm wondering how you see the Trump administration behaving towards Southeast Asia. One could contrast the first Trump administration, which was somewhat conspicuous by its absence in Southeast Asia. Key diplomatic postings went unfilled. The Biden administration was perhaps received a little bit better, but its rhetoric of democracy versus authoritarianism didn't necessarily resonate in a region populated by imperfect democracies or electoral authoritarian regimes. So what can ASEAN states expect from the Trump administration? Is Trump's transactional, personalistic approach to politics going to be amenable to them, or is his bellicose posture on China going to drive them away? What do you think we can expect?
In 3 words, pay for protection security. Military contracts and defense. And I'm thinking the Philippines, I'm thinking Taiwan, I'm thinking South China Sea disputes. I think that's in 3 words, just like how he did in the first term. He's interested in security, but you gotta pay. With transactional politics that you were mentioning in your question, that's why I responded that way. I agree with you.
Okay, I'll do 3 words.
Okay.
I'll take Peter's challenge. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about zero-sum games.
That's 4.
Zero-sum games. That's 3.
Syllabus. Sorry.
But I do worry a little bit that, and you saw this rhetoric, actually, interestingly, I mean, I saw this in the Obama administration, as when I first started seeing that actually coming when it came to U.S.-China relations. I don't think this started with Trump. I think the seeds for this were really sowed episode that started during the Obama administration, where you started seeing much more transactional thinking vis-a-vis the U.S.-China relationship and a lot of fear that it could become more zero-sum than it really needed to be given the diversity of the relation. I mean, it's a big relationship, this bilateral relationship. There's a lot to it, including the people-to-people piece, which we often kind of undermine and forget how strong and important that piece is. I always come back, you know, I think a lot in our security and economic and trade conversations, we always keep forgetting the people-to-people dynamic, which is really the strongest thing keeping our entire globe functioning in many ways is this active people-to-people engagement. So I do think, you know, something I am worried about looking forward, if you look at ASEAN, is are countries in ASEAN going to have to make false choices, maybe in some cases, when it comes to a security dimension, whether it's South China Seas, for instance, or other security arrangements where if you're having military exercises, for instance, with the Russians or another power Washington doesn't like, then are you sacrificing trade relationships for that, or getting sanctioned for that, or having higher tariffs imposed upon you, etc. So, you know, I think that the blurring of lines between the way we approach our different parts of the relationship has huge consequence for how we think about this, and really injects a lot of uncertainty into the markets, I think, for
I think it come to pursue the heat, free and open Indo-Pacific initiative. I think we continue to work with the Southeast Asian country, and Southeast Asian country maybe hope stability because very difficult relationship between China and U.S. and Southeast Asian country and the Vietnam, including Vietnam, you know, don't want to be, you know, the victim or fell in dilemma between the two great powers. About China Sea, and I think that China smart enough to know on one, you know, to wage a war in the China Sea because China knows how the Southeast Asia country, especially from the Vietnam, to deal with China in terms of, you know, military conflict. Of course, China applies, you know, the policy dividing for conquers, and that is why the Indonesia and the Vietnam want to build, you know, the upgrade the relationship to the comprehensive strategic partnership, and they focus on security cooperation. And I think the Southeast Asia country and from the Hanoi government especially, you know, they want to see how the Trump administration deal with China. If the has the lies, maybe the Vietnam or another country in Southeast Asia, you know, they change or they adjust the policy. And like I said from the beginning, how the Donald Trump government deal with the Philippines, right? And from the Vietnam, you know, we learned the lesson how, you know, in the 1955, the U.S. withdrew from the Vietnam and they left South Vietnam, you know, alone, right? So I think the key issue here, so the Southeast Asia country and so have to, you know, the deep independent policy, you know, neutralize, you know, all the relationship, and I think we don't want, you know, involve any military conflict, especially in the China Sea, because if the war that happened in China Sea, no one will know that, including China.
Okay, so I'm going to open things up to Q&A from the audience in just a minute, but I have one more question for our panelists. And up until this point, we've been focusing on the effects of these elections on Southeast Asia, but I wonder if I could reverse the lens and think about Southeast Asia's possible effects in the world. So these three elections witnessed the rise to power or the reinstitutionalization of power of illiberal populists with checkered individual histories and possible authoritarian leanings. So I wonder if you see Southeast Asia reinforcing over the coming years, or perhaps resisting this trend toward democratic erosion or democratic backsliding? And even if you do see Southeast Asia as furthering this trend, if you see any manifestations of hope as well.
Dynastic politics, proxy leadership, and nepotism, that's three characteristics of own ASEAN problems as of now. So what happened in Indonesia, what happened in India, and what happened in America becomes another sets of slippery slope or domino effects that Democrats in ASEAN would have to unite together and refresh their own playbook and have to overcome this. We have our own problems, but we are starting to see what happened all around the world through elections, except for Sri Lanka, Lithuania, and Moldova. The rest of the world turned right. And the snap election in Germany yesterday with Chancellor Olaf, CDU, and ATF. That's another thing that the world needs to be worried about, especially if you are there to promote democracy in your countries. But I'm fascinated by the campaigns of how they did it. It must be the dance. It must be the uncle dance of both YMCA, of Trump's and Provoco on that side, and also Modi joining in all cultural events and things like that. But politicians or former politicians cannot never take young people for granted. I think that's the takeaway that I got from it. You know, the way you communicate through new platforms politically, the podcasts, Twitch that Trump used, and also the lyrics that they use to capture young voters that many progressives and liberals take for granted, that if you're young, you will vote for the progressive movement. That's no longer the case. So you really have to be on the ground and keep them relevant and keep in touch with the young voters. That's something that you haven't seen until this year, or the year of super cycle elections.
I'm struck by all the strongmen we see around the world and throughout a lot of these electoral cycles. We're talking about 3 here today. I'm really curious where women are in this movement. I mean, actually, Asia, you've seen a lot of female leadership and political levels historically coming from Asia. Certainly not here in the United States, clearly. We haven't done it yet at the presidency level. You don't see this in Asia either anymore. In the same way you used to see this in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines, Thailand, other places. And so this idea that like women are also just not part of this equation at the senior levels in any of these countries that we're talking about. And that you see this, I mean, every photo I see of everyone shaking hands at these summits, trying to figure out, how to represent and bring in, we have not figured out inclusive democracy. We're gonna need to think differently, and I'm talking to the women here in the room, and whoever's watching, we're gonna have to think differently about where women fit into this. We're gonna have to run for office, and not just be the secretaries and the note takers. And we're gonna have to think about how to shape things up, and I do think ASEAN has a history of leading in this space. I think Asia and Asian women can show the world what this looks like. But there's a backsliding and regression here on norms, on values, on human rights. And we're gonna have to think structurally differently about who's really at the table and who's not here. And I think we have just given a silent pass in every one of these conversations to the fact that we're talking about allowing men to make decisions for everybody. And I hope, given what we know historically to be the case of how women have been able to make a real political stand of leadership, I hope that is out in this next generation.
In Vietnam, we call it democratic dictatorship. Or democratic centrality. So very difficult for Vietnam to develop or to be a country and become a democratic country and become independent. However, 85% of Vietnamese people want to side with the United States. And the people in Vietnam, they watch very closely, the U.S. election. Every single minute, they send a reporter to the U.S. to cover Kamala Harris campaign, Donald Trump campaign. And I hope, in Vietnam, the young generation, they love to move forward with the democracy. And that's the strong message, they want to send to government. Why, and in Vietnam, different from China, they open the social media, Google free, internet free, and especially Google and Facebook, right? And we can see the social media, the generation, they want to see and they want to learn, the democratic development from and how to build the government from the U.S. Of course, Western civilization or Western culture, Western politics influence on generation. And the U.S. election influence on the Vietnamese American people too. One generation who escaped from Vietnam after 1975, they sided with Republican. They voted for Donald Trump. 51%, but the 48% generation sided with the Democratic Party. So you can see, and we hope to move forward both sides, domestic and international Vietnamese approach, together.
Well, that exhausts my list of questions. We have about 27 minutes for questions from the audience, so we'll collect a few. You can direct them either to any individual panelists or all three of them. I'll just remind you to please speak up so the online attendees can hear you clearly.
Hi, my name is Nivia. I'm from SKS. I have a question. I'm from Indonesia. So what happened after the inauguration of Prabowo is that he ordered all of the members of his newly established cabinet to undergo a military-style retreat, where all of these ministers, 5 ministers, have to wear military uniform and wake up at 4 for morning drills. So how do you see this shift towards a more military approach will affect the region and also will affect foreign policy?
We may collect 2 to 3 questions at a time.
Hi, I'm Willie, and in particular, I have a question towards Peter and possible talent. But I was thinking, in terms of the Sino-American politics, about what policy measures can Asian countries, particularly Thailand, implement to prevent businesses from using their location to circumvent tariffs intended from Chinese origin products.
Thank you so much, by the way, for the panel. My question is to perhaps Peter and to Fatima as well. We're seeing with the re-election of Trump, perhaps the global perspective on the current American election result may not be as favorable as whatever the American population has chosen for itself. Does that bend for countries, and I'm thinking India in particular, which is also, like you were mentioning, perhaps electorally autocratic or authoritarian, does that sort of open up a vacuum on the global level of what the US's perception is now in terms of how it stands as a democracy and its foreign policy going forward? Does that maybe open up a space for other aspirational countries from other parts of Asia? How might they leverage that, and is it even possible for them to leverage that? Is that now an opportunity?
3 great questions.
So let me take, how are we going to divide this? Maybe I take 1 and 2. 1 and 2. I can, but I don't want to monopolize. I'm not autocratic. I don't go to retreats. But I'll take 1 and 2, and maybe you can take a 3rd one, if you can share. I feel like security-led world, the tension will go up, but the situation or the experience of Thailand of lost decade in the past 10 years after the military coup, it explains that because you have uniformity of the way you think, you lose our creativity and innovation. And whether, if you have army as morale police, hoping that the corruption will go down, if you have this kind of domination of ideas, it's just not the case if you look at the corruption perception index. So I think that's something that Indonesia can learn from Thailand, that it's about inclusion, about diversity, so trial and error, and that's how you come up with creativity and innovation rather than the uniformity of things. So the second question is about, you were trying to explain like how Chinese companies are already investing in Mexico and Southeast Asia to avoid what Trump is about to do.
Yeah, kind of like, and a lot of them are already like positioned themselves in Thailand,
Mhm.
and they have like businesses there, and then they ship like from Thailand.
Mhm.
Sometimes like they can go like have different tariffs from that instances.
So that could be an opportunity that you capitalize, and not just a sweatshop for China, but the way you think about transfer of technology so that Thailand can really participate. Fatima was talking about EV, for example. So 100 EVs that is being produced in China, only 40 is within China, in the Chinese market. 60% is outside. So even if it was Biden administration, they have that kind of tariff. Europe had that kind of tariff. Thailand, there's nothing like that. There's no gate-tailing. So a lot of EVs entered into Thai market, which is fine. Only that Thailand was a Detroit of Asia, and we have ICE industry that is in place, and about 1 million people is being employed in that automotive sector. So it's that kind of question that if, because of Trump presidency and the fossil fuel agenda that he has, then it's very much giving global dominance of EVs to the Chinese or not. That becomes another issue that we have to think about. That if that really happens, how do you balance or find the cadence, find the rhythm of obviously trying to electrify transportation, but at the same time making sure that the existing infrastructure that's been there for many, many years, as well as employment, is there. That's the kind of art, the kind of balance that Thailand needs.
I'm not sure I understood can you see your question differently?
Yeah, in short,
Sorry, I missed your name.
it's I'm Ritul, by the way, I'm also from HKS. In short, Trump's re-election, does that perhaps at a global level, at a multilateral level, like you were talking about how in the EV sector in particular, for China, does that globally open up doors for, say, aspirational countries like India, and in what avenues? I'm really just thinking from a perspective of how Trump's re-election is perceived at a global level from other countries. I know that there are reasons for it within the US. And again, at a global scale, what opportunities does that open up for countries that are aspiring to grow their economies? And also on a multilateral level.
I mean, I'll start maybe at the end of that. I think multilateralism coming from the US is going to be hard. I mean, that's what we saw in the first Trump presidency. I don't have any reason to suspect it's different this time around. I think you're going to see budget cuts coming to the major multilateral plays where the US typically takes a lead financial share or should be doing that in any case. So now look, there could be opportunities for other countries to step up into some of those spaces and think about, do they want to play more of a leadership role in multilateral spaces where you see a US deficit in the coming years? That would be an interesting question to think about, the reorientation of multilateral leadership, and is this an opportunity and play for smaller countries to have a larger voice at the table? Because historically, coming out of Bretton Woods arrangements, they were shut out of that. It was largely European powers in America that got those spaces. So, there are opportunities where the US retreats to think about, does someone want to take some of those spaces? And I think the multilateral space is obviously going to be a key one. The second space is climate. I mean, I'm really curious to see if you have the suspected retraction on Paris commitments, on broader climate agenda coming from the US and the Trump administration. Are there opportunities either for private sector companies, and including American private sector companies, who may still really actually want to double down in some of those areas because that's still going to be the global future, with or without the U.S. I mean, the planet, we only have an X amount of time to do this, right? And we'll be 4 more years behind exponentially in how we do the math. But globally, the planet has to make some really drastic choices faster than we're currently going. That's a reality we all face, whether or not we're elected leaders or not. So are there opportunities for newer voices to take up more space on innovation, technologies, and how we scale up faster on climate, for instance, navigating some of those challenges that we all know to be there. And then the last thing I would say is, when you have such unpredictability every 4 to 8 years of U.S. power in the global system, I would suspect, and maybe the only people that don't suspect this live in Washington, I don't know, but I would suspect that increasingly the U.S. starts to become a little less relevant because they're not bankable in the same ways on bipartisan foreign policy, which it used to be the case. It used to be the case that bipartisanship, really did characterize U.S. foreign policy and national security, actually. And there weren't that many drastic changes between the two parties. I worked in the U.S. Senate for 5 years on the foreign relations side during the 2000s, and the bickering and the partisanship was really on the domestic committee side. It wasn't so much on the foreign policy, national security side. That's a recent shift in the last 20 years. I don't know how permanent that shift is, actually. If we always think everything that's happening today must be the only thing that's happening. I don't know. I don't know how permanent some of those shifts are. It's hard to tell. If it's a more permanent shift where you don't have predictability beyond the water's edge, as we like to say in foreign policy, then I think it raises some serious questions about how bankable we are in the long term. And I think that should scare us as Americans, because it's going to have implications for U.S. power and the U.S. role on the global stage and how much we may want to matter a lot, but how much we really do may really fundamentally change if it hasn't already. So I'll just pause there, but maybe those are some quick thoughts.
Okay, time for a few more questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lynn, and I actually have 2 questions. My first question is similar to her. That Peter mentioned that if Trump imposed 60% tariff on goods from China, then ASEAN can fill that gap. So my question is, if Trump imposed 20% tariff on goods from ASEAN countries, then could this push ASEAN closer to China orbit, rather than, or instead of filling that gap? That's my first question. Second question is also, Peter mentioned that the Indonesian new president focus on international, or has this international ambition in terms of economic development. And so, but he actually has openly dismissed some Western idea on labor rights and state of democracy as inappropriate for Indonesia to adopt. So my question is, could Trump and Prabowo strike deal that means the U.S. disregard Indonesia's position on such issue, and that Prabowo adopt some of the Western idea to help his international ambition?
One word, actually. Oh, sorry, we're taking rounds, right?
Yeah, let's take a couple more questions. Let's take one question from online. Kevin?
Cobalt and nickel. That's what both of them are thinking.
We have one question on the situation in Myanmar. The audience asks, Prabowo and Modi are both leaders with tarnished human rights records. Trump's election adds to the theme of rising authoritarianism and illiberalism in this year's super cycle. How do you think this will impact international pressure and sanctions being applied to Myanmar's military junta? And will it become more difficult to hold human rights abuses to account within ASEAN?
Yes, you start.
All right, my name's Carson. So my question is really about this year's domestic politics. You mentioned as well that there's not women showing up in Southeast Asia. If you look at Singapore, the Lee family, Philippines, Thailand, all these countries have all these common families that really refuse to leave. And there's also the family fusion, the Lee family, like the young brothers and myself. So I'm just curious to hear, you guys see any situation where the young people, like, could possibly, try to reverse these trends of dynastic families or like these cycles where people keep, preferring also voting for the same people, and also how women can show up, like, outside of dynastic conflicts, like, in Thailand, right, like she's the daughter of former prime minister there, right? So, so how do you guys see any of that? That's for all of you.
How do you want to prioritize?
Let's just go down the line, and
Okay.
if any of you have anything that you'd like to say on either of those questions, be my guest.
So for the question about short-term potential of ASEAN producers overtaking Chinese producers because of the 60% tariff, that's rubber, that's food and juice, that's machineries for Thailand. I mean, I looked it up already. That these are potential industries that we can take care of if it were to happen. However, like I said, in short term it might be an opportunity, but in the long term I feel like that's not going to be the case, because what comes into the country goes out of the country. America relies on global trade of about 27%, and even if you find a short-term fix, but in a long-term competitiveness, you need incoming goods and services and talent. As per your question on India, talent, two things, biotech and space economy. Given the transition team, vaccines and space, those are something that countries outside of this Sino-American trade retaliation can think about. Second one on Prabowo, that's how I answered it. Ambition with question on credibility. Obviously, it's clear that he has international ambition, but it's a continuity from Jokowi with some criticism, with that constitutional court, the age of 35 of Gibran, and Kaesang being 29 running for provincial election. So he has that kind of legitimacy question that needs to really answer to a lot of Western leaders when he's trying to do so. On Myanmar, obviously, yes. So, to turn 5-point consensus to 5-year roadmap, you need frontier state diplomacies, and that's China, India, and Thailand. Without the frontier diplomacy of India being on board on this side, and the Chinese being on board on top, and Thailand on the right side, then you can't really come up with a right amount of pressure and the right amount of incentives so that the people of Myanmar can get together and decide what the future of the post-conflict Myanmar, how it would look like. So it has become much harder for sure. In terms of dynastic politics, I don't think of that word as a negative word by universal design, by umbrella. It's the proxy leadership. That's the problem. Just because you're a Bush or you're a Kennedy or a Lee, it doesn't throw me off right away in terms of last names. I mean, they were born like that, but in terms of proxy leadership, if you have to, you can't decide on the spot. You got to ask your parents. That's when it becomes an issue. Whether you are Trudeau, Abe, or Bush or Kennedy, it doesn't bother me that much. But it's proxy leadership that you have to go back to the Senate leader if you are Hun Manet. You have to go to your father if you are Pat on Pat to decide on something that is instant, something that is so severe, and you couldn't come up with an answer yourself. That's where the problem lies. So that's why it's a kind of pain point that our former party, Move Forward Party, was trying to do, is to have a party platform that becomes a bridge for young people to run for office without compromising their values or their bank accounts. So that's a pain point, that's for sure, but we definitely see it as an opportunity and not just a threat.
If I may just briefly add, the United States does have a dynastic politics issue as well. This was the first election since 1976 in which one of the two major party tickets did not have either a Biden, a Bush, a Clinton, or one more name that I forget it, or a Clinton on the top of the ticket, or on the ticket. So it's an issue around the world that democracies are facing.
No, I agree. I'm not trying to single out Southeast Asia.
I'm going to put on a different hat now. So I have lots of different hats. So I'm going to change up my hat for a second. So I've also spent time in civil society, in the NGO space, in the INGO space, including when I was with Oxfam. And so I want to actually put that on for a second because I want to link the online question of human rights more broadly, outside of not just Myanmar, but more broadly, and then Carson to your question as well around some of these spaces about women showing up. Look, I think if you're in civil society right now and you're looking at all these election results across the board, you're concerned. You're really concerned. This feels like a big setback in lots of different ways that are probably very obvious. I don't spell them out, particularly around human rights, gender, women's rights, and I hope what you all and what others take away and can consider in part of this is the role of civil society is going to be more important than ever in this coming decade. And as we see a retreat on the democratic stage with the rise of authoritarian strongmen in lots of different contexts and places, we're going to need civil society voices more than ever. And the good news, because there is good news here, is that we have a very rich foundation, a very strong civil society across the board. We're not starting from scratch. We're not at zero where we have to figure out how to organize, how to have voice, how to connect. I'm going to come back again, people to people. We should never underestimate the power of our people-to-people relationships. We are connected today in a way that we were never 50 years ago. We didn't know the other even existed. We actually all know the landscape. We know each other. We have names to faces to this. It's very powerful. We have global networks in civil society. How we use civil society voices to create space and create noise. I hope civil society creates a lot of noise in the coming decade. I hope not just reports and the plenaries and all this, the margins of every summit, but I hope in media, I hope in social media, I hope in youth voices, I hope civil society creates a whole lot of noise. Because that's also, when you think about your bench, your political bench, of where's the next generation of leaders, where do they need to come from? They need to come from civil society. And we talk a little bit about women, but I want to talk beyond women. I mean, we need more representation across the board of different groups, across the board in all of our countries, right? And I think that's where the bench comes from. I think it comes from civil society. So I hope we see for how hard it's going to be for civil society activists. It's already been so hard. It's going to be harder. It's going to be harder. It's life and death in some cases for some activists. I hope we can help support them, fund them, shelter them, give voice and space to civil society, and really honor that in many countries it's been civil society that has seen us through the other side. And we're going to need it more than ever. So I just wanted to kind of connect some of those dots because, and for students here at Harvard and beyond, if you're thinking about career, what can you do? It feels so difficult. How do you get involved? Where can you make a mark? If governments are not the place right now for you to make a mark, think about civil society. Think about your careers there. Think about opportunities there because it's the bench, right? In many ways, until there's a moment where it makes sense for you to go into politics.
Presidents come and go, but people stay. Prime ministers come and go, but people stay. I agree.
So about the Vietnam and more communicated. Why the Vietnam and US have shared a strategic interest in China Sea or Indo-China, Indo-Pacific have contained China influence, and the Vietnam and China share, the ideology, communism, socialism. And we know the Cold War ideological conflict shift to geopolitical competition. But the Vietnam and China, share geopolitical position, benefit, and ideological competition or allies. So how the Vietnam can build, democratic society, human rights? So very difficult because I think that China doesn't want Vietnam become, democratic country. Maybe the domino theory just come out, right? So I think that in this case, the Vietnam, again, and I think that another country in Southeast Asia have to balance between the power of US and Vietnam, as US and China very important. And I think that in terms of developing the economy, security cooperation or the culture cooperation, South Asia country always, calculate very carefully the China and the US, how the reaction, and they have collaboration. Cold War, or not a Cold War, but I think we are always, to think how we can escape from, the conflict between the great power and from the Vietnam, and that is why they, Vietnam, now use 8 comprehensive strategy partnership. And maybe the next year, the Indonesia become the 9th the comprehensive strategy partnership with Vietnam. And besides China and the US, Vietnam continue to work with Japan, South Korea, and India, and how they fortify, their power, democratic dictatorship, and developing, the economy. That's very difficult for the Vietnam to handle, the big issue like human rights or the democracy, in Vietnam, because the influence from China very strong, very strong.
Well, with that, we are closing in on the end of our time. So thank you all very much indeed for your attention. Please join me in thanking the Asia Center for hosting this event and your High Fatima team.
โอ้ยอุ้ยถือ2 เครื่องไม่ถนัดต้องขอโทษนะคะป้าไม่ได้อ่านคอมเมนต์เพราะว่าในห้องเงียบป้าทิ้งทิชชู่ไว้ตรงนี้ไหนไปดูที่ทิมโอ้ยป้าถือโทรศัพท์2 เครื่องมันเลยไม่ถนัดเดี๋ยวอึบไม่ถนัดก็จับใช่ค่ะเพราะว่าป้าไปสวัสดีค่ะภาพมันสั่นเพราะว่าป้าไปใช้ไอ้ที่หนีบโทรศัพท์ที่น้องเขาให้มาภาพมันไม่นิ่งเลยอ่ะเป็นทีมเดินออกไปแล้วถ่ายรูปแล้วมั้งโอ้ยป้า
It was like this all the time. Yeah. All the time. Throughout the past 1
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for free.
โอ้ยเดี๋ยวเอาออกก่อน
ใช่ไหมฮะขอบคุณมากเล่าให้ถ้าสมมติว่าถ้ามีเวลาเพิ่มดินเนอร์สองเดือนของทางนี้เข้าใจเลยฮะแต่ว่ามันก็คือแบบรอบละ
1, 2, 3
กายที่มาช่วยเขาแบบ
There we go.
ชื่ออะไรครับชื่อรีคือไม่ได้กินข้าวตอบแทนด้วยซ้ำเลยขอบคุณมากได้ครับไม่รบกวน
โอ้จ้าเดี๋ยวคุยกันจ้าโชคดีจ้ามิ้น
opportunistic เซกเตอร์ใดในระยะยาวคือเรากำลังเลื่อนชั้นในทางให้กับ
Are you Thai? No, I'm Indonesian. Okay.
ใช่
แต่ของช่วยเยอะมากเลยแล้วก็มีแต่ชีวิตกลับไปกลับมาHow long have you been in Boston?
This trip only a week.
Oh, long time.
Professional. 15 years.
2008?
Yeah, 2010.
So we missed each other. Like I was here in 2008, I graduated in 2011.
No, we have dinner together.
We did?
Yeah. So my wife and the Harvard my dinner time, so there was a Harvard dinner. And we were like the time.
Oh, I see.
So yeah, we had like dinner. So you would take
Oh, really? Small world.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Small, yeah.
But you stayed. And you remained here. You didn't go back.
Long story.
Long story.
That is why
you know me. You know me, right?
Absolutely.
Novalent.
Yeah. I work in biotech.
That's why. So there's a bunch of ties in biotech.
Yeah.
In Cambridge area.
Not too many.
Yeah, you look like her actually.
Yeah, I do.
That's awesome.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Likewise, take care. Enjoy.
And let me know if you're still going to come.
Maybe I get back from DC maybe Sunday or something like that. And Monday is holiday, so very high profit.
I know your schedule.
But then I come back up. Now that we're met each other.
Okay. Yeah,
that's great. Thanks. Take care.
Nice to meet you. No, I'm Chinese. I'm in the U.S., but I'm at Harvard. I'm actually finishing this fall, so that's why one aspect that I try to stream like 3D that side. But I saw this
Get things out of the way we want to, out of the way I want to reactivate my alumni email.
Yes, I guess I do see it as a negative, but I can see why people. Yeah, that's. Yeah. Are you originally from Thailand, I guess? I am.
R-I-Z-E?
Nice. Yeah, I need to go there at some point.
That's like a startup, right?
Let's see what's like.
Yeah, I know. I I think he went on a trip to Korea with it, so I know. Oh, great. His first name starts with an S, right? Yeah, I know.
I'm always very excited to like.
I think absolutely.
Yeah, I'll make sure you guys switch up. I would ask you a small group, so 3, 2, 1. Go. All right, I got it.
Enjoying slow?
Yeah.
We're most likely flattered that you I am a master's student. Oh my god, you rock Netherlands.
Any cool classes that are updated to what's going on?
So you like
during my time, 10 years ago, so 2011, we're talking about venture capital.
ถือไม้ถนัด
business
ใส่
background.
เป็นอย่างนี้กัน ป้าต้องปิดเครื่องเลยแม้นป้าไม่ได้คลิปเลย
So interesting. Something that you learn by going to classes was really about venture capital back in the days. So now, what's like the hot classes or the hot topics that slow down first? Oh, he was a dean during my time. It's great.
Yeah, they're also adding the apartments. So the HS secret, this is the first year. I'm really cool, but they're adding the first year where like there's AI that comes to school.
I'm gonna email Simon Johnson and say that I wanted to see him.
He sometimes invites like
A couple of professors learned through social media that I returned and they've been asking. I haven't had a chance to go through the list. I have a couple of requests, but trying to go down the list. I'm going to Georgetown right now. And they say, so what's your story? What classes are you taking?
I'm engaging now.
Okay.
ป้าเอาออกจากอันนี้ก่อนดีกว่า มันไม่ดีเลยไอ้ที่จับโทรศัพท์อันเนี้ยมันสั่นค่ะไม่น่าใช้มันเลย มันสั่นเอาออกแล้วค่ะ
Definitely. Like I said, I haven't had a chance.
ป้าไม่น่าใช้ไอ้ที่หนีบโทรศัพท์อันนี้เลย มันสั่น ไม่น่าเลยแต่ไม่เป็นไร ครั้งหลังยังมี ป้าอยากให้คุณทีมเซลฟี่ให้ป้า
I've come to so many of these talks. He's great.
Are you planning to return back home?
คุณทีมตัวเล็กเล็กผอม
Which part of Bangkok?
What's their specialty?
Very good.
Well, I want to ask, like, I tried to register for the small group, but there's like another way to. Oh, okay, I'll just ask.
He's a link creation guy.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I wanted to register for the small group, like, I think 3-4 weeks ago. And said the listeners were working. Yeah, just to apply. I know, like, it's small.
น้องๆว่าเป็นทีมผมยาว ผมยาว
Well, I think typing out my
They couldn't find a common consensus.
Okay.
So for me,
What's your name?
I'll find
I've seen you on the for some
I'm going for
Instead, I'm talking about and they already have that.
Well, so for the HTS, like HMS,
For me, it will be
I'm done this month.
That's like a.
Those are two things that are
Yeah.
pretty similar situation.
เดี๋ยวส่งไปเดี๋ยวผมส่งไป
Once you get a programming, they know
Oh,
each
what's,
other.
you could just.
Maybe
probably
the harder
Yeah.
issues can finally come to the table. But if they started with a hard topic.
No.
Yeah,
which event? What event? I will send it to you.
So if I were there, that's what I would do actually. So I felt like that's
I don't know
benefit
too many times.
start off with that. And then that's when they become equal.
แล้วพี่แคมสมัครที่ AMIS หรือเป็นคน organizing
No, I'm really lucky because I have one of those. It's I registered as a dual degree student, so I can actually get like student pricing. It's like there's some MIT like
Because they're all new leaders, they're all younger.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I'll send it. Like, I know like the small group might be filled up, but like I'll just maybe put my name down for that just in case.
Into the block.
Okay.
อยู่ที่นี่เหรอครับ
ผมจะกลับอาทิตย์หน้า
คณะอะไร
Oh, you're not the organizer.
No.
Okay.
So that's like his like
email.
So
Okay. Or should I just email back?
So both, just do both.
Okay.
Email me and then
Okay.
CC that.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you click down like my name, KGM, there should be just a drop down in the Harvard. I'll show you the link for like there's like an office hour application form.
Yeah, I saw it. I actually have a picture of it like from
Yeah, of course.
but the problem is it just wasn't working.
Thank you so much for it. It sounds like you've been really helping out coming to both events.
Oh, I mean, I saw him last year.
Of course.
Carson, yes, Carson.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
น้องๆคนรุ่นใหม่ที่เขาสนใจเรื่องเศรษฐกิจการเงินช่วยเขา
Yeah, Fran has been really busy with it, right? Yeah, no. I was just saying, like, if you want to do the same like application things, just message me on that like Instagram account.
Sure.
And I'll let you.
Perfect. And I'll see you tomorrow as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. He's my friend from the Philippines.
Oh, nice to meet you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I feel you've really like been,
I'm
the
older.
study group and also the class was on Monday. How was that? Some very interesting. I really wanted to stay, but I was only able to drop
At most.
Would you,
No,
it's like an interesting middle ground. It's like around 70.
Yeah. It was very interesting. Well, that's why they talk about students.
It's like always interesting to see how different people wear hats around like private events, interpersonal, like small office hours versus like
more intimate it is, and I have a
จริงๆลูกพี่ลูกน้องผมจบมาไว้อันนี้ไปอยู่มาเลเซียแล้วครับ
คุณทิมคะรบกวนขอหัวใจหน่อยค่ะ นี่อีกนิดนึงค่ะ นี่
มาจากนิวยอร์กขนาดนี้ตรงใกล้ขนาดนี้
ใช่ค่ะ
เข้าไปจากนิวยอร์กเลยเหรอ
ค่ะ2 ทุ่มค่ะ
สุดยอด
ค่ะ
คุณพี่ทำงานที่ NYU เหรอครับ
ลูกสาวเรียนค่ะ
เป็นซูเปอร์แฟน
โอ้จะถามคุณทิมพอดี ที่คุณทิมจะไป NYU เขาไม่ได้เปิดแบบนี้แล้วคนนอกจะเข้าไปได้ไงคะ
ผมว่ายังไม่ได้คอนคลูดนะ เพราะว่าเพิ่งติดต่อคุยกันว่า
ตอนนี้คือเรายังไม่ได้จัดตารางเรื่องโลจิสติกที่เรียบร้อย
ได้ไปแน่ แต่ NYU ไม่เหมือนโคลัมเบียนี่เปิดให้เข้าไปได้
เราจะต้องฝากติดตามนะครับว่าตกลงมันจะเป็นรูปแบบยังไงแล้วก็ใช่มันก็ขึ้นอยู่ว่าแคมปัสดิแมน
Like back in the days, Harvard was also very open.
And nowadays I think after Israel-Palestine tension
It's probably the same. แต่โคลอมเบียเปิด
เปิดค่ะทำไม
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I have to get up.
He has a flight to catch, so thank you so much everyone for attending.
น้องเข้ม
One, two.
You were wonderful. ถ่ายรูปนะครับ
เดี๋ยวป้าจะให้คุณทิมเซลฟี่ค่ะ
Thank you for being
เอาเพิ่มกันด้วยได้
อาหารค่ะค่ะ
Yeah, of course. One, two, three. Of course.
นี่ซื้อเครื่องใหม่มา ไลฟ์คุณทิมเลยนะเนี่ยค่ะ
1 2 3 1 2 3 amazing
เชิญเลยครับค่ะค่ะค่ะอุ้ยอันนี้ยังไลฟ์อยู่นี่คะเอานี้
จะถ่ายยังไง
ไม่ให้เห็นหน้าป้าเห็นแต่ในนั้นให้เห็นแต่ในนั้นค่ะ
อ๋อจะเอากล้องนั้นเดียวนะครับ
โอเคนั้นเดี๋ยวผมจะใส่
มันแล้วในกล้องถ่าย
อันนี้กล้องป้าค่ะ
โอเคครับ
คุณทีมเซลฟี่ให้รูปหนึ่งได้ไหมคะ
ได้ครับโอเคฝากบอกลูกสาวเดี๋ยวเจอกันที่ NYU
ค่ะ
โอเค
น้องๆที่เมืองไทยบอกคุณทีมผมยาวแล้ว
แล้วก็ไม่ทัน
ค่ะ
Good seeing you, man. Yeah, we'll catch you later. We'll talk a lot.
Is it okay if we do it outside? We just have to figure it out.
Still in my phone.
I don't know, we have to like clear
ป้าตามคุณทีมไม่ทันแล้วเอ้ยตามไปส่งคุณทิมน้องคนนี้ถ่ายรูปหรือยังคะอ๋อ
แล้วน้องก็จะเป็นความสนิทสน
รู้จัก
ค่ะน้องหมอที่สนิทกับพี่
โอเคครับเจอเขา
แล้วก็วันศุกร์เนี่ยเขาชวนพี่ไปงานที่ MIT
ได้ครับพรุ่งนี้ใช่ไหมครับผมไปครับแต่ว่าพี่ทีมเขาไม่อยู่แต่ว่า it's like a Thai Boston Wine fair เสียดายนี่ไม่ได้ไป it's 200 people usually is very fun
ที่จำได้แต่
very fun
มันไม่ใช่มีแค่ฮาวาด MIT แล้วก็มีเด็ก BU ด้วย
they have usually game competition ระหว่างเรียนอะไรนะแต่ก็อาจจะรบกวนให้คุณพี่ร่างโปรแกรมว่าการจะ it's tomorrow it's too bad you'll be in the air แต่ก็ร่างโปรแกรมมาแล้วก็ใส่อีเมลเข้าไปแล้วเราจะติดต่อเข้าไปรูปไหนครับได้ขอบคุณครับครับผมว่าชื่อโอเคครับ
อยู่ที่นี่หรือว่าไปเรียนทำงานที่นี่เลย
พรุ่งนี้คุณทีมไปดีซี
ไปเดี๋ยวนี้แล้วครับ
อ๋อเมื่อไหร่ได้เห็นคุณทีมอีกนะเข้มน้องเข้มเมื่อไหร่ป้าจะได้เห็นคุณทีมอีกล่ะคะ
ต่อไปนี่คือวันน่าจะเป็นกุมภา
โอ้แล้วช่วงมีบรรยายเนี่ยค่ะช่วงมีบรรยายป้าแอบมามองยังได้เลยอ่ะ
จริงๆก็คือไม่มี
ดีเคด้วยนะ
ตามคุณทิมป้าตามคุณทิมก่อนนะ
ขอบคุณมากครับแล้วยังไงก็จะกลับบ่อยอยู่แล้วใช่ไหม
Yeah, I'm in Thailand a lot and I'm here a lot.
You know, because we can talk a little bit biotech. I think there's a whole biotech sector there.
Sure.
I have a lot of thoughts on.
Me is helping me on a regular basis.
Oh, good. Yeah. Okay, got it.
I'll be in touch.
Yeah, cool. I'll send the picture too.
โถ
Oh, that also with
โถ
the baby.
น่ารักมากค่ะเฮ้ยน่ารักมากเห็นไหมมีแต่คนรัก
อยากดีซีก่อนแล้วมาเอาไปก่อนมาทุกเรียนบ้านอยู่ฝั่งนี้อ๋อขอบคุณมากคนไทยอยู่แถวนี้กันนะอยู่เซ็นทรัลสแควร์อันนี้อยู่ตรง
Oh yeah, I mean Harvard, but John Hopkins. I don't think it's not much of a question. I was like, wait, if you have turned down, well, actually, I had a friend who turned down Harvard before, and we all learned.
มือโทรศัพท์ป้าถือ2 เครื่องมันลวน ตามให้หายคิดถึง บทนั้นสวยค่ะเฮ้ยได้เย็นเน็ตหลุดน่าจะเป็นเพราะป้าเอาโทรศัพท์2 เครื่องใกล้กัน น้องเข้มพูดภาษาอังกฤษ น้องเข้มออกสำเนียงภาษาอังกฤษเยี่ยมมากอ่ะ ครั้งนั้นป้าก็เดินตามคุณทิมแบบเน็ตหลุด
So you moved over here when you were 12. Yeah, and you came in Baltimore. Yeah. And then during school holidays, he came over to be with you. Yeah. Every so often. Yeah. But then you don't travel back to Thailand. Not so much. Yeah. Not as long. And then now, when we yeah, but then the problem now I have a family. My family. So now I go to Thailand.
เห็ดลิ้นจืดอยู่
So I'm doing that. Your family. My family. My wife and kids are in Thailand. Like during the pandemic, they moved back and they never came back.
นั่นนะคะเห็ดลิ้นจือยังอยู่ที่ตรงกระรอกอ่ะขอบคุณนะคะที่ยังอยู่กับป้า
You share the same last name. Yeah, welcome. Just told me that they co-parents and then you have to stop What was I kidding about? I think it's just like I think when I saw you, you were coming to broke it.
โอ้
I broke my jet lag.
จุดนี้สวย
Germany.
จุดนี้สวย
So my body at some point gave up.
โอ้โหจุดนี้สวย
Election night. I mean, he's a citizen. Campaign in Thailand. I can't imagine like going through all the wearing this. Yeah. Also pretty hard for November.
อุ๊ย โอ้ตกลมพลาดตกลม
No. The company recently invested quite a lot. How long is it? Learning, sharing, fantastic, and the I don't think
Another person who told me this was a European CEO. He said, it doesn't matter where you are, just get it done in a country and whether it's true or not, we'll see.
I do think that. So whether I'm in Shanghai or Germany or whatever, I'm going. How old are you now? 44, more than you are. 44? Oh, okay. So he's 5 years older than you. But no, that's why we post your music. I was like, oh man, this guy listens to all the things. Yeah, but it's an honor to meet you. Like I'll put myself on. My first vote in Thailand. Because I never been in Thailand. I feel like this. My first and only vote. One statement.
Cuando vuelve.
ป้าลืมบอกคุณทีมพี่หลิวแล้วก็เต้นแล้วน้องอีกคนบอกคิดถึงค่ะ วันนี้เขาธุระเขายุ่งเขา มาไม่ได้เขาอยากมาค่ะ
Sí. Sí, sí,
ค่ะ
el fin de semana de Action. Es que ese fin de semana yo me voy. Pero es que es el fin de semana de Thanksgiving, ¿no? Sí, me voy para. Ay, no, sí, después. No, sí voy a estar por aquí.
งั้นหลังจากตรงนี้แล้วนะ
จ้ะ
ต้องคุยเรื่องส่วนตัวกันแล้ว
จ้า
นะครับ
จ้า
น่จะต้อง
จ้า
ต้องจากลา
แล้วแถวนี้มันมีหลุมซับเวย์ไหม
ซับเวย์ไม่ได้
ป้าต้องไป ป้าจะต้องไปเซาท์สเตชั
ตร
น
งนี้เลยครับตรงนี้ได้เลย
ค่ะ
ครับคุณนะ
คุณทิมคะ สวัสดีนะคะ ค่ะ ค่ะ น้องๆ ยังตามคุณทิมเป็นร้อยเลยค่ะ ค่ะ ค่ะ
Excuse me.
ขอบคุณมาก
ครับผม
ๆ รักคุณทิมนะคะ
อันนี้ไป
ค่ะ
ซับสเตชั
ค่ะ
นได้
ค่ะ
เลยนะ
โอ้จ้าจ้า
ขอบคุณนะครับ
จ้าจ้า
น่จะ
เข้
เจ
ม
อกันอาทิตย์หน้าไม่ถึงปีหน้า
ลอง โอ้ปีหน้า
ใช่ครับน่าจะมกราคมพา
โอ้ ดูเหมือนมันนาน ค่ะ ค่ะเนิ่นคุณทิมอยู่ตรงนู้น ดูสิคุณทิมอยู่ตรงนู้น นี่ ป้าพาไปใกล้ไม่ได้แล้ว เพราะว่าน้องเข้มต้องคุยธุระส่วนตัวกับคุณทีมค่ะ คุณทีมจะไปวอชิงตันดีซีวันนี้เลยอ้าวฝรั่งคนนี้บัง นั่นอาจจะเป็นน้องนักศึกษาก็ได้ ที่ยืนอยู่ อ๋อ คนที่เหมือนแขกไง นี่ค่ะ ป้าจะข้ามฟากไป แต่ไม่ได้ไปใกล้ค่ะ ข้ามถนน ไม่ตามไปใกล้ โอ้ย อิจฉาน้องๆทางเมืองไทย ได้เจอคุณทิมบ่อยๆ นี่ ก็จะตามไปห่างๆอย่างเงี้ยค่ะ ให้คุณทิมรับมุมตึก ให้คุณทิมเดินรับมุมตึกไป ตอนนี้ป้าซูม ใช้วิธีซูม อันนี้เป็น iPhone 16 Pro Max นะคะ ที่ป้าไลฟ์อยู่เนี่ย เสียดายไม่น่าใช้ไอ้ที่หนีบโทรศัพท์ที่น้องเขาให้มาเลย มันสั่น สังเกตคุณทิมไหมคะ คุณทิมจะเอามือล้วงกระเป๋าแสดงว่าเป็นคนขี้ร้อน ตรงนี้มันก็มีหลุมรถซับเวย์เนี่ยค่ะ นั่นน่ะ ด้านหน้าที่คุณทิมกับน้องเดินไป น้องคนเสื้อขาวอ่ะ อยู่ในทีมคุณทิม เรียนอยู่ฮาร์วาร์ดเนี่ยค่ะ ภาษาอังกฤษดีมากเลย ออกสำเนียงเยี่ยมมาก ดูสิ โอ้ย ข้ามไปนู่นแล้ว ตาม เนี่ยมันสะเทือน ตอนไลฟ์มันไม่มีปุ่มกันสั่น แต่ถ้าหากถ่ายวิดีโอมันมีนู่นนะเดินไปนู่นแล้ว ไหนล่ะ นู่นค่ะ นู่นเพราะว่ามันสั่น ป้าจำมุมนี้ได้แสดงว่าคุณทิมเดินไปเคนเนดีแน่ เดินไปเคนเนดีสคูลนั่นนะคะนั่นนี่นี่ค่ะ ขอบคุณน้องๆที่ยังอยู่เป็นเพื่อนป้านะคะ ขอบคุณจริงๆนู่นไปนู่นแล้ว คุณทิมไปเคนเนดีสคูลแน่เลย ข้ามถนนไปแล้ว ป้าไม่ตาม ถ้าจะตามก็ตามได้แต่ นั่นค่ะใช้วิธีซูมนี่เดินไปไหนเนาะรถนักเรียนหลบรถนักเรียนก่อนนะคะไหนไม่ตามแล้วนะคะนู่นค่ะนู่นเห็นหลังผู้หญิงคนนี้บังซะแล้วขอบคุณทุกกำลังใจป้าเอ็มขอปิดไลฟ์ตรง Harvard Square เนี่ยนะคะก็รอฟังครั้งต่อไปน้องเขาใช้คำว่าปีหน้าก็แสดงว่าช่วงเนี้ยถึงเดือนธันวาคุณทีมคงไม่มีการบรรยายที่ให้คนนอกเข้าฟังแบบนี้ค่ะที่ Harvard ได้ลองไปดูอีกทีสิถึงไหนแล้วอุ้ยรถไม่ทันแล้วป้าไม่รู้ว่าเลี้ยวซ้ายหรือเลี้ยวขวาค่ะคุณทีมไปแล้วค่ะอันนี้เป็นรถไฟฟ้านะคะสายระยางเนี่ยขอบคุณทุกกำลังใจนะคะขอบคุณมากๆป้าไม่น่าใช้ไอ้ที่หนีบโทรศัพท์อันนั้นเลยมันสั่นจริงๆจากนั้นป้าก็จะอาจจะไปเก็บบรรยากาศใน Harvard สักหน่อยแล้วก็จะถามลูกว่าซื้อตั๋วให้ป้ากี่ทุ่มขอบคุณมากๆนะคะขอให้น้องๆทุกคนอยู่เย็นเป็นสุขมีสุขภาพแข็งแรงนะคะขอบคุณมากๆค่ะขอบคุณมากๆแล้วป้าต้องขอโทษที่มันสั่นคือป้าจะซูมแล้วก็จะให้เห็นคนบรรยายทั้ง4คนพร้อมกันไม่ได้เลยพอกดแล้วมันสั่นมากไม่น่าใช้เลยขอบคุณมากๆป้าขอปิดไลฟ์ก่อนนะคะสวัสดีค่ะ